If you're just catching up, here's where we left off. My name's Nora, and 6 weeks ago I went back to my late wife's family estate to finish a memorial garden she'd started before she passed, and to sort through everything she'd left behind. What I didn't expect was falling for her sister Vivian, the one person in that family who'd always kept me at arm's length. We finally kissed beside that half-finished garden, and for a few seconds, it felt like everything might actually be all right. Then the guilt hit her all at once, and she ran. This is what happened next. I didn't sleep much that night, replaying that kiss over and over, and the way her face had changed right after it, like she'd looked into a mirror and seen someone she didn't recognize. By morning, I still hadn't decided what to say to her, if she'd even let me say anything at all. When I came downstairs, she was already gone, off to meet the estate attorney about final paperwork before I'd even had coffee. We didn't see each other until dinner, and even then, it wasn't really dinner together, more like two people forced into the same room by habit and politeness. She'd gone back to the version of herself from that very first day, composed, distant, answering my questions with short, careful sentences that gave nothing away. I tried once to bring up what happened by the reflecting pool, and she cut me off before I could finish, saying quietly that she'd rather not discuss it, that some things were better left where they happened. The days that followed fell into a strange, careful rhythm. We still worked, because the estate didn't stop needing things just because we'd stopped knowing how to look at each other. But every conversation stayed clipped and formal. Every shared task done with careful distance between us, like she'd drawn an invisible line neither of us was allowed to cross again. I caught her watching me sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking, and every time I turned toward her, she'd already found something else to focus on. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. This sudden return to the coldness I thought we'd moved past together. I told myself I understood it, that guilt could make people retreat into whatever version of themselves felt safest, but understanding it didn't make it sting any less. Some nights I sat in that guest room with the locked wooden box still hidden in my suitcase, wondering if I should just leave it unopened and let whatever secret it held stay buried, along with everything else that seemed too complicated to face. The estate attorney called a formal meeting near the end of that week, the kind neither of us could avoid, going over final details of the will, the timeline for the property transfer, what still needed to be settled before the 6 weeks were up. Vivian sat across the table from me in that meeting, looking every bit the composed heir she'd been raised to become, answering questions about trusts and deadlines in a voice that gave nothing away about the woman who'd kissed me in the garden only days before. I watched her during that meeting more than I listened to the attorney, noticing the tight set of her jaw, the way her hands stayed folded a little too carefully in her lap, like she needed the discipline of stillness to keep herself from unraveling. When the meeting ended, she thanked the attorney, walked him to the door herself, and then disappeared into her study without another word to me, the sound of the door closing behind her louder than it needed to be. That night, I couldn't stand the silence between us anymore, so I knocked on her study door, telling myself I just wanted to talk, even though some smaller, more honest part of me wanted more than that. She opened it slowly, surprised to see me there, and for a brief second, before she caught herself, I saw something soften in her face. Then it was gone, replaced by that same careful distance, and she asked politely if something was wrong. I told her the truth, that I couldn't keep pretending nothing had happened between us, that watching her shut down completely was somehow worse than the guilt she was clearly drowning in. She was quiet for a long moment, standing in that doorway like she couldn't decide whether to let me in or close the door between us for good. When she finally spoke, her voice was thinner than I'd heard it in days, saying she didn't know how to be the kind of person who let herself want something without immediately believing she didn't deserve it. I asked her gently if that was really about Caroline, or if it went back further than that, back to being 19 and losing every version of the life she thought she was going to have. She flinched slightly at that, like I'd found something true she wasn't ready to look at directly. She didn't answer right away, and for a moment I thought she might close the door on me after all. Instead, she stepped back and let me into the study, gesturing toward the chair across from her desk without quite meeting my eyes. We sat there for a while in silence before she finally admitted, quietly, that she didn't know how to separate loving me from betraying her sister. That every time she let herself feel something good, some old part of her immediately started looking for the price she'd have to pay for it later. It was the most honest thing she'd said since the kiss, and it broke my heart a little, hearing just how deep that fear actually ran in her. I told her I wasn't asking her to have it figured out, that I didn't have it figured out either, that all I wanted was for her to stop disappearing every time something real passed between us. She looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, and just as I thought she might finally say something that mattered, the moment shifted again, her guard sliding back into place like a door quietly clicking shut. She said it was getting late, that we should both get some rest, and the conversation ended there, unfinished. The same way almost everything between us had been since that kiss beside the garden. I left her study that night with more questions than I'd walked in with, and lying awake later, staring at the ceiling of that guest room, I thought about the locked wooden box still hidden in my suitcase, Caroline's handwriting etched across the bottom of it, addressed to a sister who still hadn't learned how to let herself be loved. I didn't know what was inside it. But some quiet, certain part of me understood that whatever Caroline had wanted to say to Vivian, it might be the only thing capable of reaching the parts of her that I clearly couldn't get to on my own. I spent the next morning turning that locked wooden box over in my hands, trying to decide if opening it was even my choice to make. It had Vivian's name on it, not mine, and everything in me knew that whatever was inside belonged to her, not to me. But after everything that had happened between us, after watching her retreat further behind that careful mask every single day, I couldn't shake the feeling that this box might be the only thing capable of reaching her. I searched through the rest of Caroline's things that morning looking for a key, going through drawers, old jewelry boxes, anywhere she might have hidden something that small and important. I finally found it taped to the inside cover of one of her journals, wrapped in a small scrap of paper with Vivian's name written on it in Caroline's handwriting, like she'd planned for someone to find it eventually, maybe even hoped it would take a while. My hands were shaking by the time I held the actual key. I didn't open the box myself, not fully. I told myself that much, that whatever was inside deserved to be seen by Vivian first, not filtered through my own curiosity. But I did turn the key in that little brass lock, just enough to see that it held papers, folded and yellowed slightly with age, and one loose sheet sitting right on top that had clearly been written more recently than the rest. The ink darker, the handwriting less steady than Caroline's usual careful script. I could see just enough of the opening lines to know it was a letter addressed directly to Vivian. Started sometime after Caroline had gotten sick, judging by the date scrawled in the corner. I closed the box again immediately, feeling like I'd trespassed somewhere sacred, and sat there for a long time with it in my lap, trying to decide what the right thing to do actually was. Part of me wanted to protect Vivian from more grief. But a bigger part of me understood that some things need to be said, even late, even painfully, especially when the person who needed to hear them was still walking around carrying guilt for things that were never actually her fault. I found Vivian in the garden that afternoon, checking on the last of the new plantings, and I almost lost my nerve twice before I actually walked up to her. She looked up when she heard me approaching, her expression guarded the way it had been for days, already braced for another conversation neither of us knew how to finish. I held the box out to her without saying much, just that I'd found it hidden in one of Caroline's boxes, wrapped like it had been meant for her specifically, and that I thought she should have it, whatever was inside. Vivian went very still, staring at the box like it might be dangerous. She asked, quietly, if I'd read it. I told her the truth, that I'd seen enough to know it was a letter addressed to her, but that I hadn't read the rest, that it wasn't mine to read. She took the box from my hands slowly, her fingers brushing against mine for just a second, and I watched her throat work as she swallowed hard, staring down at her sister's handwriting etched into the wood. She asked me to stay while she opened it, which surprised me, because everything about the last few days had suggested she wanted less of me around. not more. I sat down beside her on the garden bench, close enough to offer whatever comfort I could without pushing, and watched her hands tremble slightly as she turned the small key and lifted the lid. Inside were more papers than I'd realized. Letters, it looked like, spanning what must have been years. But she went straight for the one on top, the newest one, the one written after the diagnosis. I watched her eyes move across the page, watched her face change with every line. Grief and shock, and something that looked almost like anger flickering across her features in quick succession. Her hands were shaking hard enough now that the paper crinkled slightly. She read for a long time, longer than the length of the letter probably required, like she kept going back to reread certain lines she couldn't quite process the first time through. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were full, tears already falling freely down her face in a way I hadn't seen from her even that day with the pressed flower. Her voice came out cracked and raw when she finally spoke, saying that Caroline had known, that her sister had somehow known, even sick and running out of time, exactly how much guilt Vivian carried, exactly how much she blamed herself for things that were never her responsibility to fix. She said Caroline had written that she hoped, someday, Vivian would let herself want something just for herself, and that if she ever found someone who made her feel less alone, she shouldn't run from it out of loyalty to a sister who only ever wanted her to be happy. I felt my own throat tighten hearing that secondhand, understanding immediately what those words must have cost Caroline to write, and what they now meant sitting in the middle of everything happening between me and Vivian. I didn't say anything, didn't push, just stayed close beside her while she cried, her shoulders shaking with the kind of grief that had clearly been locked away for a very long time, finally given permission to come out. I reached over and took her hand again, the way I had that day in the study, and this time she gripped it back immediately, like she needed something solid to hold on to while everything else in her came undone. We sat like that until the sun started dipping low again, her hand in mine, the letter resting open across her knees, the rest of the box's contents still unread beside her. She didn't say much else, just kept staring at her sister's handwriting like she was trying to memorize it before the moment passed. But something had shifted in the air between us, something neither of us said out loud yet, though I could feel it sitting there anyway, quiet and fragile, and finally, maybe, possible. Whatever Caroline had wanted to give her sister with that letter, I understood now that it wasn't permission exactly. It was an invitation. And I had no idea yet whether Vivian was ready to accept it. Vivian didn't say much for the rest of that evening, but she didn't pull away from me either, which felt like its own kind of answer after everything that had happened between us over the last week. She asked if I'd sit with her a little longer, and we ended up on that garden bench until it got too dark to see the letter in her lap anymore, neither of us in any hurry to go back inside and let the real world catch up with us. The next morning, she found me in the kitchen before I'd even finished my coffee, and there was something different in the way she moved, lighter somehow, like she'd set down a weight she'd been carrying for longer than just the last few days. She asked if I'd walk with her, not toward the garden this time, but down toward the water, along a path I hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind an old stone wall at the edge of the property. We walked for a while without talking much, the morning fog still hanging low over the water, and I let her set the pace, sensing she needed the quiet before whatever she wanted to say next. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than it had been the day before, though still careful, like she was choosing each word with real intention, instead of just letting them fall out the way most people do. She told me she'd read the rest of the letters that morning, the older ones too, going back years, and that somewhere in all of them she'd started to understand something about herself she'd never let herself look at directly. She said she'd spent 17 years telling herself that staying behind to manage the estate, to handle their parents' illness, to hold everything together, had been a choice made purely out of love. But reading Caroline's words, she realized some part of her had also been hiding, using duty as a reason to never have to risk wanting anything that could be taken away from her the way her parents' health had been taken so suddenly. I listened without interrupting, understanding that this wasn't a conversation that needed my input yet, just my presence. She said she used to watch Caroline fall in love, watch her leave, watch her build a whole life outside that house. And instead of feeling proud, some ugly, quiet part of her had felt resentful. Not because she wanted Caroline to suffer, but because she couldn't understand how her sister had managed to let herself be that brave when she never could. Her voice caught slightly saying that out loud, like admitting it made it more real than it had been sitting quietly inside her for years. She said she'd never told anyone that before, not even Caroline, especially not Caroline, because saying it out loud felt like betraying how much she'd actually loved her sister underneath all that quiet resentment. I told her that loving someone and resenting a piece of their freedom weren't mutually exclusive, that grief and guilt rarely followed any kind of clean logic, and that carrying both didn't make her a bad sister. It made her human. She stopped walking then, turning to face me fully for the first time since we'd started down that path. The fog starting to burn off around us as the morning sun broke through. She said she was tired, plainly and simply. Tired of managing everyone and everything except her own life. Tired of believing that wanting something good for herself automatically meant taking it away from someone else. She said she didn't fully know how to stop being that person, the dutiful one, the composed one, but that she wanted to try. I asked her carefully what trying looked like to her. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the water instead of at me, and I could see her working up the courage to say whatever came next. She said it looked like not running the next time something between us felt too big to handle. It looked like admitting that what she felt for me wasn't a betrayal of Caroline, but maybe somehow the last gift her sister had ever given her. Whether either of them had planned it that way or not. My chest felt tight hearing that, full in a way that had nothing to do with sadness this time. I told her I understood if she needed time, that I wasn't asking her to have everything figured out in one conversation on one foggy morning. She reached for my hand then, lacing her fingers through mine the same careful way she had beside the reflecting pool, and said she didn't want more time right now. She just wanted honesty, slow and real. Built one true conversation at a time instead of one dramatic moment we both panicked and ran from afterward. We stood there by the water for a long while after that, her hand in mine, both of us quiet, letting the moment exist without needing to rush it into something bigger than it already was. It wasn't a kiss this time, and it didn't need to be. It was something steadier, something that felt like the actual beginning of trust, instead of just the aftermath of fear. Walking back up toward the house together, our hands still loosely joined between us, I understood that whatever had shifted in Vivian over those letters, it wasn't finished unfolding yet. But for the first time since I'd arrived at Ashworth House, I let myself believe it might actually be heading somewhere good. The next few days felt like something new entirely, quieter and steadier than anything that had come before, like we'd both agreed without saying it out loud to stop bracing for the moment this would fall apart. Vivian still kept some of her careful composure during the day, especially when the housekeeper or estate staff were around. But the walls she'd built up over the last week had come down enough that I could actually feel her presence differently now. Warmer, closer, less guarded than I'd ever seen her. We spent one whole afternoon in the kitchen together, which surprised me, because I hadn't pictured Vivian Ashworth as someone who'd ever willingly cook anything herself. She admitted, a little sheepishly, that she barely knew how, that most of her life someone else had always handled things like meals, and she asked if I'd show her how to make something simple. I taught her how to make the same soup my mother used to make growing up, nothing fancy, just something warm and honest, and she laughed more that afternoon than I'd heard from her in the entire 6 weeks combined. She asked me question after question about my life back home, not the polite, distant curiosity her family used to show me at those old dinners, but real interest, wanting to know what an ordinary Tuesday looked like for me, what I loved about arranging flowers, whether I ever regretted not choosing something that paid better. I told her the truth, that the shop barely kept me afloat most months, but that there was something about working with my hands, about creating something beautiful out of almost nothing, that felt more honest than anything money could buy. She got quiet for a moment after that, staring down at the soup she was stirring a little too carefully. And then she admitted that she envied it. The plainness of a life built around something she actually loved, instead of something she'd inherited an obligation to protect. She said she couldn't remember the last time she'd done anything purely because she wanted to, rather than because it needed doing. I told her that was allowed to change, that wanting things for herself wasn't some rule she had to keep breaking in secret. That evening we sat out on the back terrace together, watching the last boats come in off the water, the way Caroline used to describe from her childhood, and Vivian asked me more about the shop, wondering aloud if I'd ever consider expanding it, doing something bigger with it someday. I told her I'd never really let myself think that far ahead, that surviving month to month didn't leave much room for dreaming bigger. She looked at me for a long moment after that, something thoughtful behind her eyes. But she didn't say anything more about it, just let the comment settle quietly between us. It struck me, sitting there, how much had changed between two people who barely knew how to speak to each other only weeks earlier. She wasn't performing composure for me anymore, wasn't managing our conversation the way she managed everything else in her life. She was just Vivian, softer around the edges than the woman who'd opened that front door on my first day. And I found myself falling for this version of her slowly, steadily, in a way that felt nothing like the sudden storm-shed intensity of before. It felt like something built to last, brick by careful brick. We didn't kiss again during those quiet days, though there were moments it would have been easy to. Moments where her hand lingered near mine a little too long, where her eyes held mine a beat past what was necessary. I understood without her saying it that she needed this part first, the slow rebuilding of trust in herself, as much as in me, and I was more than willing to let her have that at her own pace. Some nights we just sat together in the study, reading through more of Caroline's letters side by side, not out of obligation anymore, but because it felt like something we wanted to do together. One evening, going through an older letter, we found a passage where Caroline had written about a version of the future she used to imagine for her sister, a version where Vivian finally let herself fall in love with someone who saw past the composed exterior she showed the world, someone who'd love the parts of her that were tired of always being strong. Vivian read that passage twice, quietly, before she looked over at me, something unspoken but clear passing between us in that shared silence. The estate attorney had already confirmed the final paperwork would be ready within the week, meaning my 6 weeks at Ashworth House were coming to an end faster than either of us seemed ready to admit out loud. Neither of us brought it up directly during those quiet, warm days, but I could feel the shape of it sitting at the edges of every conversation anyway, a deadline neither of us had asked for, closing in regardless of how unfinished everything between us still felt. Lying awake one of those last nights, I thought about how much had shifted since that first cold greeting at the front door, how a woman I'd once believed incapable of warmth had somehow become the person I found myself wanting to talk to before falling asleep every single night. I didn't know yet what would happen once the paperwork was signed, once the official reason for me being there disappeared completely. But some quiet, hopeful part of me had started to believe that whatever this was between us, it might actually be strong enough to survive without a legal deadline holding it together. The final papers came sooner than either of us expected, the attorney calling to say everything was ready for signature 2 days ahead of schedule, which meant my 6 weeks at Ashworth House were suddenly, officially, almost over. I remember standing in the hallway when Vivian told me, watching something flicker across her face that I couldn't quite read, gone before I could ask her about it. That evening, she seemed different, quieter in a way that felt less like peace and more like retreat. I told myself it was just the weight of finalizing everything, closing out her sister's affairs for good. But there was something in the way she held herself at dinner that reminded me uncomfortably of that very first night, composed and careful, and just slightly out of reach. I asked if she was all right. She said she was fine, a little too quickly, the same automatic answer she used to give before she'd ever let me see past it. The next morning she was gone before I woke up, off early to meet the attorney in person to finalize the last of the paperwork, and she didn't come back until well into the afternoon. When she did, she went straight to her study without finding me first, which she'd stopped doing over the last week and a half. I gave her space, telling myself she probably just needed time to process the finality of it all, signing away pieces of her sister's life one document at a time. By evening, the distance between us had grown into something I couldn't ignore anymore. She was polite over dinner, asking about the last of the garden work, but there was a careful formality creeping back into her voice that hadn't been there in days. I asked her directly if something had changed, if I'd done something wrong. She told me no, too fast again, and then excused herself early, saying she had more paperwork to finish before the property officially transferred. I lay awake that night turning it over, trying to understand what had shifted so suddenly after everything we'd built over the past week. It wasn't until I saw her the next morning, standing at the edge of the finished memorial garden with a folder of documents in her hands, that I started to understand. She told me, without quite looking at me, that once the transfer was finalized, she'd already accepted a position helping manage a family foundation 2 states away, something she said she'd been asked to take on months ago, but hadn't given a real answer to yet. My stomach dropped hearing that. I asked when she'd decided, and she said only that morning, like it had been a sudden decision instead of something considered. I asked her, carefully, if this had anything to do with us, with what had been building between us this past week. She was quiet for too long before she answered, and when she finally did, her voice had that same practiced evenness from our very first conversations, the tone she used when she needed to convince herself of something more than she needed to convince me. She said maybe it was for the best, that she'd spent her whole life responsible for things bigger than her own feelings, and that maybe this was just one more version of that, choosing duty over whatever fragile thing was happening between the two of us. She said she didn't want to build something serious out of 6 intense, grief-soaked weeks that might not survive contact with ordinary life once the deadline pulling us together disappeared. I felt something in my chest crack hearing her fall back into that same old pattern, dressing fear up as responsibility the same way she'd been doing since she was 19 years old. I told her that wasn't fair, not to either of us, that this wasn't the same as staying behind for a sick parent or managing an estate out of obligation. This was her choosing to run from something good because good things had always felt too dangerous to trust. She flinched at that, and for a second I thought I might have actually reached her. But she just shook her head and said she needed to finish the paperwork, walking back toward the house before I could say anything else, leaving me standing alone in the garden that was supposed to have been about healing. I spent that whole last afternoon packing, moving through the guest room in a kind of numb autopilot, folding clothes I barely remembered unpacking 6 weeks earlier. Part of me kept expecting her to knock on the door, to say she'd changed her mind. But the house stayed silent, except for the sound of estate staff finishing their own preparations for the property transfer. By evening, my suitcase sat by the door, zipped and ready, the same way it had the day I arrived. Except now leaving felt like losing something far bigger than I'd ever expected to find there. I stood in that guest room for a long time after I finished packing, staring at that suitcase, remembering the locked wooden box I'd carried up those same stairs 6 weeks ago, remembering how much had changed since then. Whatever fear had taken hold of Vivian again, I understood now that it ran deeper than grief, deeper than guilt over Caroline, straight down to that 19-year-old girl who'd learned that wanting things for herself always seemed to cost her something in the end. I didn't know if I had the power to change that pattern in her, but standing there with my suitcase packed and the car waiting outside for the morning, I knew I wasn't ready to leave without at least trying one more time. I didn't sleep at all that last night, lying there listening to the house settle around me the way it had every night for 6 weeks, except this time I knew it was the last time I'd hear it. By morning, the car the estate had arranged to take me back down the coast was already waiting in the driveway, and I stood at the top of the stairs with my suitcase in hand, half expecting Vivian to be somewhere nearby, ready to say something that might change everything. She wasn't. The housekeeper told me Vivian had left early for one final meeting with the attorney, something about signing over the last of the transfer documents in person, before the office closed for the property sale. I stood there in that grand front hall for a moment, the same hall where she'd first opened the door to me 6 weeks earlier, and felt something close to disbelief that it might actually end this way, quietly, without either of us saying the things that mattered most. I carried my suitcase out to the car myself, the driver waiting patiently by the open door, and I paused there on the gravel driveway, looking back at Ashworth House one last time. The memorial garden was visible from where I stood, finished now, exactly the way Caroline had drawn it, flowers blooming along paths that hadn't existed 6 weeks ago. It should have felt like an ending worth being proud of. Instead, it just felt unfinished, the way everything between me and Vivian had been left unfinished too. I got into the car and told myself I'd done what I could, that I couldn't force someone to choose bravery over fear no matter how much I wanted to. The driver started down the long driveway, gravel crunching under the tires the same way it had the day I arrived, and I watched the house grow smaller in the side mirror, feeling something heavy settle into my chest that I recognized immediately as grief. Except this time it wasn't only for Caroline. We were maybe halfway down the driveway, almost to the main road, when I saw her. Vivian, actually running, down the front steps of the house in low heels that clearly weren't made for it, waving both arms at the car like she needed the driver to see her before we disappeared around the bend completely. My heart slammed hard against my ribs, and I told the driver to stop before he'd even fully processed what was happening. I got out of the car before it had completely stopped moving, and Vivian closed the last of the distance between us at a near run, breathless, her composed exterior nowhere in sight for the first time since I'd known her. She stopped just short of me, chest heaving, clearly having sprinted the entire way from wherever she'd actually been, and I realized in that moment she hadn't gone to any attorney's office at all. She said my name first, just that, like she needed a second to catch enough breath to say anything else. Then she said she'd been sitting in her car in the driveway for the last 20 minutes, unable to make herself drive away, rehearsing every single reason she'd given herself for letting me leave, and realizing every single one of them was just fear wearing a more respectable name. She said she was so tired of calling her fear duty, tired of mistaking self-protection for strength, tired of watching herself become exactly the kind of person Caroline's letters had begged her not to be. Her voice broke completely on the next part, saying that she didn't actually want the job 2 states away, that she'd only said yes because leaving felt safer than staying and risking everything with me. She said Caroline would want this, would want her to be brave enough to choose something good instead of running from it, and that she was done proving her sister wrong about who she really was, underneath all that careful composure. She said, plainly, without any performance left in her voice at all, that she loved me, and that she was terrified, and that she didn't want to be scared enough to lose this anyway. I didn't say anything right away, too overwhelmed to trust my own voice, just closed the last small distance between us and wrapped my arms around her, feeling her whole body finally relax into me, like she'd been holding herself rigid for 6 straight weeks and had only just now allowed herself to stop. She held on to me just as tightly, her face pressed into my shoulder, both of us standing there in the middle of that gravel driveway like the rest of the world had simply paused to let us catch up with ourselves. When she finally pulled back enough to look at me, her eyes were wet but steady in a way I hadn't seen from her before, something settled and certain replacing all that careful fear. She asked if I'd stay, not for 6 more weeks, not for any legal deadline or attorney's paperwork, but because she wanted to actually try building something real with me, slowly, honestly, without either of us running from it the next time things got difficult. I told her yes, before she'd even finished the question, my own voice thick with everything I'd been holding back since I'd packed that suitcase the night before. Standing there together on that driveway, her hands still gripping mine like she was afraid I might disappear if she let go, I understood that whatever came next wouldn't be easy, that grief and guilt didn't just vanish because 2 people finally chose each other. But watching her, finally unguarded, finally choosing to stay instead of protecting herself from something good, I felt something settle deep in my chest that I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. For the first time since Caroline died, I let myself believe that healing and love weren't opposites of grief. Sometimes, they were exactly what grief was quietly making room for. We walked back up to the house together after that, hand in hand, and it felt different from every other walk we'd taken across that property over the past 6 weeks. Nothing about the driveway had changed. The same gravel, the same view of the water down the hill, but everything about how I moved through it felt lighter, like some enormous weight I'd been carrying without realizing it had finally been set down. I told the driver he could go, that my plans had changed, and Vivian laughed softly at how simple that sentence sounded compared to everything it actually meant. We stood there a moment longer, watching the car disappear back down toward the main road, and I felt her fingers tighten gently around mine, like she still needed proof every few seconds that I was actually staying, that this wasn't something she'd have to talk herself out of all over again. Inside, the house felt different too, quieter in a good way, like it had been holding its breath right along with both of us for 6 weeks and could finally exhale. Vivian led me through to the kitchen without either of us discussing it, and we ended up exactly where we'd been that afternoon, making soup together, except this time there was no task to hide behind, no excuse to keep our hands busy instead of just being near each other. She made tea again, the same way she had that very first day, except this time her hands weren't shaking with nerves or grief, just something steadier, calmer, like she was finally comfortable enough in her own home to simply exist in it. I sat at that same enormous kitchen island that used to make me feel so small and out of place, and for the first time it just felt like a kitchen. Nothing more intimidating than that. We didn't talk much, not right away. There wasn't any urgent need to fill the silence with words anymore, not after everything that had already been said out on that driveway. She sat close beside me instead of across from me, her shoulder brushing mine, and every few minutes she'd reach over and touch my hand or my arm, small, unnecessary touches that had nothing to do with comfort or grief anymore, just simple, quiet affection. At some point she rested her head against my shoulder, and I felt her exhale slowly, fully, the kind of breath that comes after holding tension in your body for far too long. I wrapped my arm around her without thinking twice about it, and we stayed like that for a long while, listening to the quiet sounds of the house around us, the distant clock in the hallway, the wind moving gently through the trees outside. She said eventually that she wanted to show me something, and led me back out through the kitchen doors toward the garden, the light starting to shift into that soft gold color that comes right before evening. We walked the finished paths slowly, no rush in either of our steps, and she pointed out small details in the planting I hadn't noticed before, the way certain flowers had been placed so they'd bloom at different times throughout the year, meant to keep the garden alive and changing long after the day it was finished. I realized, walking beside her, that this garden wasn't only a memorial anymore. It had become something else entirely over these 6 weeks, a place where grief had slowly made room for something new to grow right alongside it, the same way Vivian had. She seemed to understand that too, standing quietly near the reflecting pool where everything had first cracked open between us, her hand still resting easily in mine. We didn't say much else as the afternoon faded into evening. There wasn't any need to fill every silence with words anymore, not after everything we'd already survived to get here. Instead, we just existed together in that quiet, unhurried way that only comes after two people have finally stopped bracing themselves against each other, her shoulder against mine, her thumb tracing slow, absent circles against the back of my hand. At one point, she looked over at me, something soft and open in her expression, nothing guarded left in it at all, and she said quietly that she hadn't felt this settled in longer than she could remember, maybe not since before her parents got sick, maybe not ever. I told her I understood exactly what she meant, that I felt the same steadiness sitting there beside her, something I hadn't let myself feel since long before Caroline passed. The sky above the water had started turning that deep gold color again, the same light that had been there the evening of our first kiss, and I felt her fingers tighten gently around mine as we both noticed it at the same time. Neither of us moved to go back inside. We just stood there together at the edge of the finished garden, watching the light change, both of us fully present in that moment for maybe the first time since I'd arrived at Ashworth House. As the evening settled fully around us, quiet and golden and entirely ours, I felt Vivian turn toward me slowly, her eyes searching mine with a certainty that hadn't been there before. Like every single fear she'd been carrying had finally gone still. I didn't know exactly what was about to happen between us in that garden as the light faded completely, but standing there with her hand in mine, I understood we were about to cross into something neither of us would ever be able to take back, and for the first time, neither of us wanted to. The light faded slowly around us, gold sliding into that deep blue that comes right before nightfall, and neither of us moved to break the moment by suggesting we head back inside. Vivian's hand tightened slightly in mine, and when I looked over at her, I found her already watching me, something open and unguarded in her expression that I hadn't seen from her even in our quietest moments together over the last 6 weeks. She said my name softly, and there was nothing hesitant in it this time. None of the fear that had colored every close moment between us before. She said she'd spent so many years believing that wanting something for herself meant she was somehow failing everyone who depended on her, and that standing there with me in the garden her sister had designed, she finally understood how wrong that belief had always been. She said Caroline hadn't left her that letter to add more guilt to what she already carried. She'd left it to set her free. I felt my throat tighten hearing that, understanding exactly how much it had cost her to arrive at those words honestly, instead of just repeating them because they sounded right. I told her I was proud of her, quietly, meaning it completely, and I watched something in her face soften even further at that, like she wasn't used to hearing those particular words directed at herself instead of at everything she managed and protected for other people. She reached up and brushed her fingers lightly along my jaw the way she had that day in the shed, except there was no storm this time, no fear driving the moment, just steady, quiet certainty. I leaned into her touch without hesitation, my eyes finding hers in the fading light, and I felt my own heartbeat settle into something calm instead of anxious. Like my whole body finally understood there was nothing left to brace against. Neither of us said anything else. There wasn't anything left that needed saying out loud. Not after everything we'd survived to get to this exact moment. Standing together at the edge of a garden built out of grief that had somehow, slowly, become something else entirely. She closed the last small distance between us herself, her hand sliding gently to rest against the side of my neck, and I felt her breath, warm and unhurried, just before her lips met mine. The kiss was nothing like the one beside the reflecting pool weeks earlier. Nothing panicked or fleeting about it this time. It was slow and certain, her hand steady against my skin instead of trembling, mine resting careful and sure at her waist, both of us fully present in it, instead of half bracing for the moment it would end. I felt her smile faintly against my mouth, the smallest thing, but it undid something in my chest completely. When we finally pulled back, there was no horror waiting in her expression this time, no flood of guilt rushing in to steal the moment away from us. Just quiet, open happiness, her eyes glassy but calm, her forehead resting gently against mine like she wasn't in any hurry to put even that small distance back between us. I felt her exhale slowly, and I understood it was relief. The kind that only comes after finally setting down something you've carried alone for far too long. She whispered that she loved me again, steadier this time than it had been on the driveway, like saying it twice made it more solid, more real. Something she could actually trust wouldn't be taken away from her the moment she let herself believe in it. I told her I loved her too, and meant it completely, understanding that this love hadn't erased what I felt for Caroline, hadn't replaced it or dishonored it, but had simply grown up quietly alongside it, in the space grief had slowly, gently made room for. We stood together at the edge of that garden for a long while after, her head resting against my shoulder, my arms wrapped around her while the last of the daylight disappeared completely, and the first few stars started showing above the water. Neither of us rushed to go back inside. There was nowhere else either of us needed to be. Nothing left pulling at us from outside that quiet, golden moment we'd both fought so hard, in our own separate ways, to finally reach. Looking back now, I understand that garden gave both of us something neither of us expected to find there. Caroline built it as a place to be remembered, a final gift shaped out of flowers and stone. But somewhere in finishing it together, in fighting through grief and fear and every wall we'd both built to protect ourselves, it became something more than a memorial. It became the place where two broken, careful hearts finally learned how to trust each other completely. I didn't know that night everything that would come next for Vivian and me. All the quiet mornings and harder days still ahead of us. All the ordinary life we still had to build together outside the 6 weeks that had brought us this far. But standing there in the dark with her in my arms, I knew, with a certainty I hadn't felt about anything in a very long time, that whatever came next, we were going to face it together. Caroline never got the chance to see her sister let herself be loved the way she'd always hoped she would. But I like to believe, standing in that garden she designed with her own hands, some quiet part of her was there with us anyway, finally at peace, watching the two people she loved most find their way back to each other through her. Almost 2 years have passed since that night in the garden. And if you'd told me back then, standing in the dark with my heart still racing, that I'd be sitting here writing this with a life so full, I sometimes have to remind myself to breathe through it, I don't think I would have believed you. But here we are. Ashworth House looks different now, not in any way you'd notice from the driveway, but in every way that actually matters. It stopped being a museum of who Vivian used to be, and slowly turned into a home for who she's actually becoming. The formal dining room barely gets used anymore. We eat most nights at that same kitchen island where she once made me tea with shaking hands, except now her hands are steady, and so is everything else about her. My little flower shop back in town became something bigger than I ever let myself imagine it could be. Vivian was the one who pushed for it, gently, the way she does everything now, suggesting a small partnership between the shop and the estate's own gardens, supplying flowers for the memorial paths and beyond. It sounds simple when I say it like that, but it changed everything for me, gave me something I'd built with my own 2 hands room to actually grow, instead of just survive month to month. Vivian changed too, in ways that still catch me off guard sometimes in the best way. She stepped back from managing every last detail of the family foundation, hired real help for the first time in her life, and let herself have actual mornings that belong only to her, quiet ones, spent walking the garden with coffee before the day asks anything of her. She still carries a version of that careful discipline she grew up with. I don't think that ever fully disappears, but it doesn't run her life anymore. She runs it. We talk about Caroline often, more than either of us expected we would. It stopped feeling like something we needed to protect each other from and became something we simply share, the same way you'd share any other part of a full life. Some evenings Vivian tells me stories about her I never heard before, little things from their childhood, and I tell her stories from our years together. And somewhere in all that sharing, Caroline stays exactly where she should be, present, loved, never forgotten, never a wound we're afraid to touch. The memorial garden bloomed fuller every single season since we finished it. And it's become something neither of us anticipated when we first started that project out of grief and obligation. People from town started asking if they could walk through it. And eventually Vivian opened it up on certain weekends, just quietly, without any fuss, letting other people find whatever comfort they needed among those same paths that once held so much of ours. This past spring, on an ordinary Tuesday morning that started out like any other, Vivian came and found me in the garden before I'd even had my coffee. I remember the light was still soft and gray, the kind of morning that usually moves slowly. And she had this look on her face I couldn't quite place at first, somewhere between nervous and completely lit up from the inside. She didn't say anything right away. She just took my hand and pressed it gently against her stomach and waited for me to understand. It took me a second longer than it probably should have. And then it hit me all at once, and I felt my whole chest crack open in the best possible way, tears coming before I could even get a single word out. She was laughing and crying at the same time, telling me we'd been trying quietly for a few months now, not wanting to say anything out loud until she was sure. And that morning she'd finally gotten the confirmation we'd both been hoping for, without fully letting ourselves believe it yet. I held her right there in the middle of that garden, the same place where everything between us first cracked open years earlier, and I thought about how far we'd both come from two grieving strangers standing awkwardly in a front hallway. Vivian, who once believed wanting anything for herself was some kind of betrayal, was standing there glowing, completely unguarded, choosing this, choosing us, choosing a whole future she once didn't think she was allowed to have. We're going to be mothers together. I still catch myself saying that sentence out loud sometimes just to feel the shape of it, still amazed at how naturally it fits after everything it took to get here. Vivian jokes that our child is going to grow up thinking the whole world smells like fresh flowers, and I tell her that sounds like exactly the kind of childhood I'd want for any kid of ours, rooted in something real, surrounded by people who chose each other on purpose. Some nights I still think about Caroline, about that letter locked away in a small wooden box, about how she somehow knew, even while she was dying, that her sister deserved a life bigger than duty and grief. I don't think she could have imagined this exact version of how things turned out, but I like to believe she'd recognize it anyway, the joy underneath it, the healing that grew out of everything she left behind. Grief made room for this. It always does, eventually, if you let it. If this story found you at the right moment, whatever you're carrying right now, I hope it reminds you that love doesn't always follow a straight or easy path, and sometimes the family you build looks nothing like the one you expected. Thank you so much for staying with me through this whole story, from that first knock on the door all the way to right here. If Nora and Vivian's story meant something to you, do me a favor and hit follow on RP, Forbidden Romances, so you never miss the next one. Drop a like on your way out, and let me know in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. There's a lot more where this came from, and I'd love to have you back for it.